We live in a world that teaches us to be in control, to have everything figured out, and to plan every detail of our lives. From an early age, we are told to set goals, create strategies, and push forward no matter what. While planning and preparation are important, there comes a point when we have to recognize that we are not in control of everything. No matter how much we plan, unexpected challenges will arise, detours will happen, and life will take turns we never anticipated. It is in those moments of uncertainty that we have a choice. Will we continue struggling to control everything, or will we surrender to God and trust His plan? Surrendering to God does not mean giving up or becoming passive. It means acknowledging that His wisdom is greater than ours and that His plan is far better than anything we could create on our own. When we try to take control of everything, we often find ourselves stressed, overwhelmed, and frustrated because things do not go the way we expected. But when we let go and allow God to guide us, we experience a sense of clarity and peace that we could never achieve on our own. Think about the times in your life when you have struggled the most. Maybe you were trying to force a situation to work out the way you wanted, only to see it fall apart. Maybe you pursued a relationship, a job, or an opportunity that seemed perfect, but no matter how hard you tried, it did not happen the way you envisioned. In those moments, it is easy to feel defeated, to question God, and to wonder why things are not going your way. But what if those disappointments were actually divine redirections? What if what seemed like failure was actually God protecting you from something that was never meant for you? God sees the full picture. He knows what is ahead and He knows what is best for us. When we insist on controlling everything ourselves, we often limit what God can do in our lives. But when we surrender, when we let go of our own need to dictate the outcome, we make room for God to move in ways we never imagined. This is where true clarity begins to emerge. When we stop relying on our own understanding and start trusting God fully, He reveals the next steps. He opens doors we never even knew existed. So many of us struggle with uncertainty because we are trying to figure everything out on our own. We seek clarity by overanalyzing, by worrying, by trying to predict the future. But real clarity does not come from human reasoning. It comes from spiritual surrender. When we release our grip on control and hand our lives over to God, we start to see things differently. We start to understand that even the delays, the disappointments, and the struggles have a purpose. Instead of questioning why things are happening, we begin to ask, God, what are you teaching me through this? Where are you leading me? This shift in mindset is powerful. It moves us from frustration to faith, from stress to peace, from confusion to clarity. Suddenly, we are no longer weighed down by the need to figure everything out. We are no longer wasting energy trying to control things that are beyond our power. Instead, we are walking in alignment with God's will, trusting that He is guiding our steps. Some of the most successful, fulfilled, and purpose-driven people are not those who have tried to control everything, but those who have learned to trust in something greater than themselves. They have surrendered their plans to God, and in doing so, they have found clarity, peace, and direction. The more we fight for control, the more we struggle. The more we surrender, the more we gain. God's way is always higher, His plan is always greater, and when we finally let go, we allow Him to lead us to places we never thought possible. Trusting God is not just about believing in Him. It is about taking action even when the path is unclear. Many people say they have faith, but when challenges arise, their actions do not align with their words. They hesitate, they second guess, and they wait for everything to be perfect before moving forward. But faith does not work that way. Faith is not about having all the answers before taking a step. It is about stepping forward even when you cannot see the whole picture. It is about trusting that God will provide the next step as you move forward in obedience. One of the greatest examples of this is found in the story of Abraham. God told Abraham to leave his home and go to a land that He would show him. Abraham did not receive a full roadmap or a clear destination. He was simply told to go. If Abraham had waited for more details, if he had refused to move until he had all the answers, he would have never stepped into the promises that God had for him. His faith was demonstrated through action, through his willingness to take steps, even when he did not know what was ahead. The same principle applies to us today. Many people wait for the perfect conditions before making a move. They wait until they have complete clarity, until every detail is lined up, until there is zero risk. But life does not work that way. If you wait for everything to be certain, you will never take action. Sometimes God requires us to move first. He requires us to trust Him enough to step out in faith even when we do not have all the answers. That is where real growth happens. That is where true faith is tested and strengthened. Fear often holds people back from taking action. fear of failure, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of uncertainty. But fear is not from God. Fear is the enemy's way of keeping us stuck, of preventing us from stepping into the blessings and opportunities that God has prepared for us. Faith, on the other hand, moves us forward. It pushes us beyond our comfort zone and into the life God has designed for us. When Peter saw Jesus walking on the water, he asked if he could come to him. Jesus said, "Come." In that moment, Peter had a choice: stay in the boat where it was safe, or step out onto the water. The boat represented security, familiarity, and control, but Jesus was outside of the boat, calling Peter to something greater. Peter took the step, and for a moment, he walked on water. It was only when he let fear creep in that he started to sink. This story is a perfect illustration of what happens when we trust God enough to take action. When we focus on Him, we can do things that seem impossible. But the moment we let doubt take over, we begin to sink into uncertainty. God calls us to take steps even when we do not have full clarity. Maybe you feel called to start something new, but you are afraid of failure. Maybe you know deep down that God is leading you to make a change, but you are waiting for a sign. The truth is, sometimes the sign is simply the desire God has placed in your heart. Sometimes the confirmation comes after you take the first step, not before. Faith is not passive, it is active. It requires movement, risk, and trust. It requires stepping into the unknown, believing that God will provide the answers as you go. It means making decisions based on trust rather than fear. It means moving forward even when you do not see the full picture. When you trust God with your steps, He will not let you fall. He will guide you, protect you, and open doors that you never expected. But it all starts with action. It all starts with a willingness to move forward even when the path is unclear. Challenges are not random obstacles. They are divine tests that strengthen our trust in God's plan. Too often, people see hardships as signs that they are off track, as if difficulty means they must be doing something wrong. But in reality, some of the greatest breakthroughs come after the greatest battles. Every challenge we face has a purpose, and that purpose is often to deepen our faith and reliance on God. When things are going smoothly, it is easy to trust God. It is easy to say that we have faith when everything is working in our favor. But real trust is proven in the struggle. When the unexpected happens, when doors close, when prayers seem unanswered, this is where faith is tested. God does not test us to break us. He tests us to build us. He allows challenges to shape us, to refine us, to prepare us for greater things. Consider the story of Joseph. He had dreams of greatness, but instead of seeing them fulfilled right away, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Every step of his journey seemed to take him further away from his destiny. But what seemed like setbacks were actually setups. Every challenge prepared him for the moment when he would step into his God-given purpose. Had Joseph never gone through the hardships, he would not have developed the strength, wisdom, and character needed to lead a nation. The same is true for us. When we go through difficulties, it is easy to ask, why is this happening to me? But a better question is, what is God teaching me through this? Every challenge is an opportunity to grow, to develop endurance, and to strengthen our trust in Him. If we never faced difficulties, we would never develop the resilience needed to step into the next level of our calling. God often uses trials to remove things from our lives that are holding us back. Sometimes He allows relationships to end because they are not meant to be part of our future. Sometimes He closes doors because there is something greater ahead. We may not always understand His ways in the moment, but when we look back, we can see how He was guiding us all along. Challenges also reveal where our true trust lies. Do we trust God only when things are easy, or do we trust Him even when we cannot see the outcome? Do we stand firm in faith, or do we let fear and doubt take over? These are the moments that define our spiritual maturity. David, before he became king, faced many trials. He was anointed as king, but instead of stepping immediately into that role, he spent years running for his life from King Saul. He could have given up, he could have questioned God's plan, but instead he remained faithful. He trusted that even in the hardship, God was working. And because of that trust, he eventually walked into the destiny that was prepared for him. Our response to challenges determines how we move forward. Some people allow struggles to make them bitter. But those who trust God allow struggles to make them stronger. When we stop seeing trials as punishments and start seeing them as preparation, everything changes. We no longer resist the process, we embrace it. We no longer complain about the struggle, we use it as an opportunity to grow. No one enjoys going through difficult seasons, but those are the seasons that shape us the most. They strip away distractions, they deepen our dependence on God, and they strengthen our ability to trust in His timing. When we embrace the challenges as divine tests rather than random obstacles, we start to see them for what they really are, stepping stones toward the greater purpose God has for our lives. God's timing is perfect. Delays are not denials, but part of His greater purpose. One of the hardest things for us to accept is waiting. We live in a world that values speed, where instant results are expected and patience is often overlooked. But God does not operate on human timelines. He sees the full picture, and He knows when the right moment has come for His plans to unfold in our lives. What we see as a delay is often a divine setup for something greater than we can. When we pray and don't receive an immediate answer, doubt begins to creep in. We start to wonder if God has forgotten us, if we are being ignored, or if we have done something wrong. But silence does not mean absence. Just because we do not see movement does not mean that God is not working behind the scenes. Many times He is aligning the right people, preparing the right circumstances, and shaping us into the person who can handle the blessings He has in store. To think about the story of Moses, he knew from a young age that he was called to deliver God's people from Egypt. But his first attempt to take action failed, and he ended up fleeing to the wilderness. For 40 years he lived as a shepherd, far from the palace where he once stood. To some, it might have looked like he missed his opportunity, like his calling had passed him by. But in reality, God was preparing him. Those years in the wilderness were not wasted. They were a time of growth, refinement, and preparation. When the right time came, God called Moses back, and he was ready to step into his destiny. Waiting on God requires trust. It requires believing that even when nothing seems to be changing, He is still in control. It is easy to get frustrated, to try to force things to happen in our own strength. But when we do that, we often end up with results that are far less than what God intended. Abraham and Sarah were promised a child, but when years passed with no sign of fulfillment, they took matters into their own hands. The result was unnecessary complications and struggles, but when God finally fulfilled His promise in His timing, it was exactly as it was meant to be. There is always a reason for the wait. Sometimes God is protecting us from something we cannot see. Sometimes He is strengthening our faith, teaching us to rely on Him rather than our own understanding. Other times He is waiting for us to be ready. We might think we are prepared for the next level, but God knows the weight of the blessings we are asking for. He knows what it will require, and He is shaping us to be able to carry it. Joseph spent years in prison before he was elevated to a position of power in Egypt. David was anointed as king, but spent years running for his life before taking the throne. Jesus Himself spent 30 years in preparation before stepping into His public ministry. In each case, the waiting was not wasted time, it was necessary for their calling. When we understand that delays are not denials, we begin to see waiting as a time of purpose rather than punishment. Instead of becoming discouraged, we learn to trust that God's timing is always better than ours. We learn to rest in the fact that if something is not happening yet, it is because it is not the right time. And when that time finally comes, everything will fall into place in a way that only God can orchestrate. God's guidance often comes in ways we do not expect, requiring us to trust beyond what we can see. Many times we look for direction in obvious places, waiting for a clear sign, a voice from heaven, or a perfectly mapped out plan. But God's ways are higher than our ways, and His guidance does not always align with our expectations. He speaks in whispers, through circumstances, through people, and sometimes even through obstacles. The key to recognizing His guidance is not just looking for the spectacular, but being sensitive to the subtle ways He leads. When we seek guidance, we often want certainty before we move. We want to know the outcome before we take the first step. But faith does not work that way. Faith requires us to trust even when the path is unclear, to move forward even when we do not have all the answers. God's direction is often revealed one step at a time. He does not give us the full picture because He wants us to depend on Him daily, to walk closely with Him, to develop a relationship, rather than just receive instructions. Think about how God led the Israelites through the wilderness. He did not give them a detailed map of their journey. Instead, He guided them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. When the cloud moved, they moved. When it stayed, they stayed. They had to depend on Him each day, trusting that He knew where He was leading them. If God had given them a full map, they might have relied on their own understanding rather than His presence. The same is true for us. Sometimes he withholds the full plan because he wants us to rely on him, not just on a roadmap. There are times when God's guidance comes through closed doors. We may pray for an opportunity, and when it does not happen, we feel discouraged. But sometimes a closed door is God's protection. It is him redirecting us towards something better, something we may not yet see. Paul experienced this in his ministry. He wanted to preach in certain regions, but the Holy Spirit prevented him. At the time, it may have seemed confusing, but later he was led to Macedonia, where a great revival took place. If Paul had forced his way into the places he originally wanted to go, he would have missed where God truly wanted him to be. God also guides us through peace. When we are making a decision and we feel uneasiness in our spirit, that can be a sign that something is not right. On the other hand, when we are in alignment with God's will, there is a peace that surpasses understanding, even if the situation itself is uncertain. That peace is a confirmation that we are on the right path. Sometimes God's guidance requires us to step out in faith before we see the provision. When the Israelites reached the Jordan River, the waters did not part until the priests stepped in. They had to act first, demonstrating their faith, and then God moved. Many people wait for all conditions to be perfect before they take action, but often God is waiting for us to take the first step. When we move in faith, he meets us there. We must also be careful not to let fear drown out God's guidance. Fear can make us second guess, hesitate, and stay stuck when God is calling us forward. But fear is not from God. He calls us to trust him even when we do not fully understand. There are times when his guidance does not make sense in the moment, but when we look back, we see that every step was ordered. Every delay had a purpose, and every challenge was preparing us for something greater. His direction is not always predictable, but it is always perfect. Obedience to God brings blessings, even when we do not understand his instructions. Many times we want to see the full picture before we obey. We want all the answers before we take action. But God does not call us to partial obedience. He calls us to trust him fully, even when the path is unclear. Obedience is not about convenience. It is about faith. It is about surrendering our will to his, knowing that his ways are always higher, even when they do not align with our own understanding. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of people who obeyed God without knowing the full outcome. Noah was commanded to build an ark when there was no sign of rain. He had never seen a flood before, but he trusted God's word and acted in faith. His obedience saved not only his life, but also the lives of his family. If he had waited for visible proof, he would have been too late. Obedience often requires us to move forward before we see the evidence. Abraham was told to leave his home and go to a land that God would show him. He was not given a detailed plan, only a promise. But because he obeyed, he became the father of many nations. Had he hesitated, had he demanded certainty before stepping out, he would have missed the destiny God had prepared for him. Obedience opens the door to God's blessings in ways we cannot always foresee. Sometimes obedience is difficult because it requires sacrifice. God may ask us to give up something that feels important, to let go of a relationship, a job, a habit, or a personal desire. In those moments, obedience can feel like a loss. But God never asks us to give up something without the intention of replacing it with something greater. When we surrender in faith, we make room for his perfect will to unfold in our lives. Peter experienced this firsthand. After fishing all night and catching nothing, Jesus told him to cast his net on the other side of the boat. From a human perspective, this made no sense. Peter was an experienced fisherman. He knew the waters, and he had already tried everything. But instead of arguing, he obeyed. The result was an overflow of blessing, so much that his nets began to break. One simple act of obedience turned a fruitless effort into an abundant miracle. Obeyed obedience is still disobedience. Many times we know what God is asking of us, but we hesitate. We want confirmation after confirmation, delaying our response out of fear or doubt. But the longer we wait, the more we risk missing the opportunity God has placed before us. When God calls, the right time to obey is now. Obedience is not always about big dramatic moments. Sometimes it is in the small, everyday decisions, choosing to forgive when it is easier to hold a grudge, speaking words of encouragement when we feel like staying silent, trusting God with our finances instead of clinging to our own security. These acts of obedience may seem small, but they build a life that is aligned with God's purpose. God rewards obedience, though not always in the ways we expect. Sometimes the blessing is immediate, like Peter's overflowing nets. Other times it comes after a season of waiting, like Joseph's promotion after years of hardship. But one thing is certain, obedience never goes unnoticed by God. He sees every step of faith, every sacrifice, every moment of trust. And in his perfect timing, he brings the reward. The greatest example of obedience is Jesus himself. In the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing the suffering ahead, he still prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." His obedience led to the greatest victory in history. If we follow his example, trusting God, even when it is difficult, we position ourselves for the abundant life he has promised.